Silas Crow didn't ask. He never asked. He crossed the dance floor of the Red Creek Grange Hall like a man walking through property he already owned, and every soul in that room felt it. The way the music seemed to hesitate, the way conversations died mid-syllable, the way even the fiddle player lost his rhythm just watching him move. He stopped directly in front of Evelyn Ashcroft and held out his hand. Not an invitation, a command dressed up to look like one. "You'll dance with me," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. That was the point. Evelyn didn't move. Her chin stayed level, her emerald eyes held his without flinching, even as every person standing within 20 feet took one quiet step backward, clearing space the way animals clear space around something dangerous. Silas smiled. That was worse than the demand. "I don't believe I've been asked," she said. His smile didn't waver. "I don't believe you're in a position to make that distinction." The hall went absolutely silent. If you've ever watched someone be humiliated in slow motion, the crowd frozen, nobody moving, nobody helping, then you already know the feeling sitting in that room right now. Stay with this story. Hit that like button. Drop your city and country in the comments so I can see exactly how far this tale has traveled. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because what one ranch foreman does in the next 30 seconds is going to change every single life in Red Creek, Montana, including his own. The spring dance was the one night a year when Red Creek almost forgot what it was. For a few hours, the town's rough edges softened. Ranchers who spent their days worrying about drought and debt pulled their wives onto the worn plank floor and remembered why they'd come west in the first place. Children stayed up past their bedtimes, drunk on sugar and fiddle music. The Grange Hall smelled like pine resin and candle wax, and the particular sweetness of women who had taken extra care getting ready. There was something forgiving about a dance, the way it let people pretend, just temporarily, that life was simpler than it was. Rhett Calloway hadn't planned on coming. He'd spent the better part of the day mending fence line on the north pasture of the Hargrove Ranch, where he served as foreman, and by the time he'd washed the dirt from his hands and changed his shirt, the sun was already sliding behind the mountains. Going to the dance meant putting on his good boots, which pinched his right foot in cold weather, and making conversation with people he spent most of the week actively avoiding. He was 34 years old and had lived in Red Creek for 6 years, and he was not what anyone would call a natural presence at social gatherings. But his bunkmate, a gap-toothed cowhand named Earl Pickett, had given him a look over supper that Rhett recognized, the particular look of a man who has decided he's going to needle you until you give in. "You're going," Earl said. It wasn't a question. "I'm not." "You say that every year. And every year I mean it. And every year you end up there anyway, standing in the corner with a cup of punch you don't drink, watching the school teacher and thinking thoughts you don't say out loud." Rhett had put down his fork at that. "What's that supposed to mean?" Earl smiled the unhurried smile of someone who knows he's already won the argument. "It means what it means." So Rhett had put on the good boots and the pinched toe and walked the 3/4 of a mile into town in the thin spring dark, telling himself the whole way that he was only going because Earl would never let it go otherwise. He told himself that because it was easier than admitting the other thing. The Grange Hall was already full when he arrived. He could hear the fiddle from half a block away, a quick reel, something lively. And through the window, the lantern light spilled out warm and gold onto the muddy street. He pushed through the door and immediately wished he'd brought his hat, which he'd left on the peg at the bunkhouse because Earl had said hats indoors were an embarrassment. The room was the usual Red Creek crowd, ranching families, a few merchants, the town's doctor and his wife, a handful of cowhands cleaned up to varying degrees of success. Rhett nodded to the people he knew, accepted a cup of punch he didn't intend to drink, and worked his way to the side of the room where the wall would hold him up. He found her without trying. That was always how it worked with Evelyn Ashcroft. He didn't look for her. She simply organized the room around herself without meaning to. She was standing near the far end of the hall in a green dress the color of spring grass, talking to Margaret Forsyth, the wife of the mercantile owner. Even at that distance, even with 50 people between them, something about the way she held herself cut through the noise. Rhett had been watching Evelyn from that careful distance for 6 months. She'd arrived in Red Creek the previous September, hired as the new school teacher after old Thomas Briggs finally retired. He remembered the morning she'd pulled up in the stage because half the town had turned out. Word traveled fast about a single woman arriving from the east, especially one traveling without family. He'd been crossing the street when she climbed down, and he'd stopped walking without meaning to. She was beautiful in a way that made men stupid and made him, specifically, want to walk in the other direction. He'd seen beautiful women before. He'd known a few. Beauty by itself didn't move him. What moved him was the moment right after she stepped off the stage and looked at the crowd looking at her. That small, steady settling of her shoulders. The way her chin came up just slightly, not arrogantly, but with the particular resolution of someone who has decided exactly how much of themselves they're going to offer to strangers. That was the moment he'd stopped walking. He'd been careful since then. He watched her the way a man watches something valuable through a store window, appreciatively, with the clear understanding that the glass was there for a reason. She was not the kind of woman you approached with a cup of bad punch and a pinched toe. He was thinking approximately that thought when the music stopped. Not at the end of a song. Mid-phrase, the fiddle trailing off awkwardly, as though the player's bow arm had simply stopped responding to instruction. The sudden quiet was wrong enough that Rhett turned from the wall. Silas Crow had walked in. Crow was not a large man, which somehow made him worse. He was average height, average build, somewhere north of 50 with gray at his temples, and the easy, practiced posture of someone who had never been required to make themselves small for anyone. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county, a stretch of rangeland that reached from the foothills to the river basin, and he owned it the way some men own things. Not because he'd built it through any particular effort, but because he'd understood early that possession and money were the same thing spelled differently. He came to town events occasionally, never because he wanted to participate, always because he wanted to be seen. There was a difference, and everyone in Red Creek understood it. He handed his hat to the man behind him, a thick-necked ranch hand named Denton, who served as something between an employee and an enforcer, and scanned the room the way a man scans a room he's thinking of buying. His eyes found Evelyn Ashcroft. Rhett watched Crow cross the floor, and his gut went cold before his brain caught up with why. The crowd parted. Not dramatically. People didn't leap out of the way. They just drifted, glasses moving to other hands, conversations shifting, bodies realigning themselves without any single person seeming to decide to move. It was instinctive, the way animals move away from something that radiates threat at a frequency below what you can name. Crow stopped in front of Evelyn. He held out his hand. The gesture was smooth, the gesture of a man who has extended his hand many times in many rooms and has never once been left standing with it in the air. "You'll dance with me," he said. Margaret Forsythe took a small step backward. Around the room, other small steps were happening, the same collective retreat, and Rhett could see Evelyn registering it in the slight tightening around her eyes, could see her understand that the room had just communicated something about how this moment was going to go. "I don't believe I've been asked," Evelyn said. Her voice was level, clear enough to carry without being raised. Something moved behind Crow's eyes. "I don't believe you're in a position to make that distinction." The silence in the room had weight to it. Rhett felt the cup in his hand, the cheap ceramic warm from the punch, and he was aware of his feet before he was aware of any decision, his body moving before his judgment could register an objection. He crossed the floor in 12 steps. He remembered, later, being very aware of the exact sound his boots made on the planks. Practical, unhurried sound. Not a charge, not a rush. Just a man walking across a room at his own pace, in his own time. He came up beside Evelyn, close enough that his shoulder was nearly touching hers, and he looked at Silas Crow. "She's with me," Rhett said. Crow turned toward him slowly, with the measured pace of a man who is used to being the most patient person in any confrontation. He looked at Rhett the way you look at something unexpected on the floor, not alarmed, but assessing. "Calloway," he said. The name came out flat. "That's right." "I wasn't aware you had a claim here. I'm making you aware now." A long beat. The room held its breath. Rhett could feel 50 pairs of eyes on the back of his neck, and he kept his attention on Crow, and kept his hands loose at his sides, and kept his face entirely neutral, because the worst thing you could do in a moment like this was give a man like Crow something to react to. Crow's eyes moved to Evelyn, then back to Rhett. The smile that crossed his face was the kind that never reached the eyes. "We'll talk again," Crow said. To Rhett, not to Evelyn. He was already, in his own mind, talking to the relevant party. He turned and walked back across the floor, his hand dropping to his side, and the crowd reformed behind him the way water closes over a stone. Someone near the front said something to someone else, barely audible, and then the fiddle player found his nerve and came back in on a new song, a slower one this time, and the room began to breathe again. Evelyn turned to Rhett. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't read. Not gratitude exactly, not relief, something more complicated and more guarded than either. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I know." "He's going to be angry." He was already angry. He just hadn't had a direction for it yet. She held his eyes for another moment. "I don't need someone to manage my situations." "No," Rhett said. "I could see that. You were handling it fine." Something shifted in her face, not softening exactly, more like a door opening by a fraction, the kind you notice only because you've been watching the door. "Then what was that?" "That was me being selfish," he said. "I wanted a reason to walk over here." She didn't smile, but she looked at him differently. "Rhett Calloway," she said, testing the name. "Yes, ma'am." "You're the foreman at the Hargrove Ranch. Have been for 3 years. You've never said 2 words to me before tonight. That's accurate. And now you're claiming me in front of the whole town." He'd been holding the punch cup this whole time, and he looked down at it, suddenly aware of how ridiculous it was. "I may not have thought through every detail." She took the cup from his hand, the gesture so matter-of-fact it startled him, and set it on the nearest table. "Can you actually dance?" "Tolerably." "That's an honest answer, at least." She turned toward the floor. "Come on, then, since apparently you've made this commitment on behalf of us both." He fell into step beside her, and he had the strange sensation of a man who has jumped from something and is only now beginning to register the height. They danced the next 3 songs, and he danced them tolerably, as advertised. She was better than he was, considerably better, with a natural ease in her body that he associated with someone who had grown up in rooms where dancing was expected. She didn't remark on his shortcomings. She also didn't pretend they weren't there, which he appreciated. Between the second and third song, while they waited for the fiddle to start up again, she said, "He's watching us." "I know." He didn't turn around. "Does that concern you?" "It concerns me some," Rhett admitted. "Not enough to change what I'm doing." She was quiet for a moment. "Why did you really come over?" He considered the question. There was an easy answer and a true answer, and with this woman he already had the instinct that easy answers would be noticed and filed away as the failure they were. "I watched him walk across that floor," Rhett said, "and I knew what it meant. I've seen Crow operate for 6 years. That wasn't a man asking a woman to dance. That was a man putting a thing in its place." He paused. "I didn't want to watch that happen to you." She considered this. "You didn't know me." "I knew you well enough." "From watching from across the room?" "People show you who they are," he said, "if you pay attention." The fiddle came back in, and they stepped back onto the floor, and she didn't say anything else about it. But later, when the evening wound down and people began gathering coats and children, she found him near the door. "Walk me home," she said. Not a question, not exactly an invitation. Something in between. The night air outside was cold the way Montana nights in spring are cold. A clean, serious cold that the day's warmth hasn't quite earned the right to push out yet. They walked the 4 blocks to the schoolhouse, where she rented the small attached residence, and neither of them spoke much, and neither of them felt the need to. At the gate of the small picket fence, white, slightly crooked, one hinge working better than the other, Evelyn stopped and turned to face him. "You should know something," she said, "about why I left Philadelphia." "You don't have to tell me anything." "No, but I'm going to because you'll hear it from someone else eventually, and in this town it'll be worse by the time it reaches you." She held her hands clasped in front of her, and he noticed she wasn't cold, or if she wasn't showing it. "My father was a banker, moderately successful, well-respected. When I was 22, it came out that he had been involved in a series of fraudulent loans. The collapse was significant. Several families lost money. He died before the investigation concluded, which meant I was left in the middle of everything. His reputation, their anger, the bank's lawyers, all of it." She said this the way you say something you have rehearsed to the point where the emotion has been separated from it, like cleaning meat from a bone. Clean, efficient, but you could still see the shape of the thing. "I'm sorry," Rhett said. I didn't do anything wrong. I want to be clear about that. I didn't know about the loans. But in Philadelphia, the daughter of a man like that, it follows you. I couldn't teach there anymore, so I came here. Red Creek seems like a long way to run, Rhett said. He said it gently. It does, she agreed. I thought distance would be the same as starting over. She paused. I'm beginning to suspect they're different things. They are, he said. Completely different things. She looked at him. And what about you? Why does a man like you spend 6 years in a place like Red Creek without making anything of it? The directness of it surprised him, though he wasn't sure why it should. She'd been direct from the first sentence. A man like me. A man who's clearly capable of more than running someone else's cattle. He was quiet for a moment. I had a ranch once. Small spread. About 40 miles east of here. Couple hundred head, decent water rights. He looked at the crooked fence gate, the loose hinge. My partner and I ran it together for 3 years. He had a gambling problem I didn't know about when we went into business. By the time I understood the full situation, the debt had eaten most of what we'd built. I paid off what I could and walked away. That wasn't your debt to pay. No, but he didn't have anything left, and some of the people he owed had families. He shrugged one shoulder. I don't know. It seemed like the right thing at the time. Maybe it was stupid. Or maybe it wasn't, she said. They looked at each other across that small, ordinary distance. The gate between them, the cold night around them, the faint sound of stragglers from the dance still audible a few blocks away. Silas Crow isn't going to leave this alone, Evelyn said. No, he's not. He wanted to humiliate me, and you stopped him. Men like that don't absorb that kind of thing. They file it away and they wait. I know that. So you understand that tonight may have made things harder for you. I understood it when I started walking, he said. She unclasped her hands. The gesture was small, just releasing something she'd been holding, but it felt like something shifting. Thank you for the dance, she said, and the walk. Thank you for letting me. She went through the gate and up the path to the door, and she didn't look back, which he respected. He stood there for a moment after the door closed, the cold coming in steadily now, and then he turned and walked back toward the edge of town. His right foot was killing him. He'd forgotten about it entirely for the last 2 hours, and now it came back all at once. He thought about what he'd just done, the calculation of it, or the lack of calculation. And he decided, walking back through the dark spring night with the mountains black against a sky full of stars, that he didn't regret it. That was unusual for him. Rhett Calloway was a man who reliably regretted things in retrospect. He found the absence of it interesting. Earl was still up when he got back to the bunkhouse, reading by lamplight, and he looked up with the expression of a man expecting information. Well, Earl said. Good night, Rhett said, and went to bed. He lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the ranch settle around him, and he thought about a woman standing at a gate with her hands clasped and her chin level, telling him her worst story, the same way she told everything, clearly, without decoration, without asking for anything in return. He thought about Silas Crow's smile, the one that never reached the eyes. He thought about the next morning and what it would bring and whether he was ready for it. He thought about the way the fiddle had died mid-phrase when Crow walked in, and how the whole room had shifted one step backward, and how Evelyn had stood there anyway, her chin up, waiting. He fell asleep thinking about the hinge on her gate, the loose one. He thought about how it would only take 20 minutes, maybe a little lumber scraps and a new pin, and it would stop being crooked. He thought about that for a while, and then he stopped thinking. Outside the bunkhouse, the Montana spring pushed cold air down off the mountains and across the range, and the cattle were quiet in the near pasture, and the stars over Red Creek burned the way they always did, indifferent and beautiful and impossible to count. Across town, in the small residence attached to the schoolhouse, Evelyn Ashcroft sat at her writing table in the dark for a long time before she lit the lamp. When she finally did, she pulled a sheet of paper toward her and began writing. Not a letter, just notes, the way she always processed the things that she needed to process. She wrote, He looked at Crow and didn't flinch. She paused, tapped the pen against the edge of the table. She wrote, He knew what it would cost, and he came anyway. She sat with that for a while. Then she folded the paper and put it in the drawer and blew out the lamp and went to bed. 3 blocks away, in the largest hotel room Red Creek had to offer. He always took the largest room, as a matter of habit. Silas Crow sat in his chair by the window and looked out at the dark street and thought about Rhett Calloway, and about women who didn't know their situations well enough to understand them, and about how patience was the most underrated quality a powerful man could possess. He was not angry. That was the thing people misunderstood about him. Anger was a short-term emotion. What Silas Crow felt when he had been publicly contradicted was something cooler and more durable than anger. He was interested. He poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey, and he thought about Evelyn Ashcroft standing in that green dress with her chin up, and he thought about a 6-year ranch foreman with calloused hands and good boots having the audacity to cross the floor. He drank his whiskey slowly. He was, above almost everything else, a patient man. And in Red Creek, Montana, in the spring of what was shaping up to be a long and interesting year, patience was going to be worth a great deal. The morning after the dance, Red Creek woke up the way it always did. Slowly, with the particular reluctance of a town that had learned not to expect much from its mornings. Rhett was at the north fence line by sunup, which was where he wanted to be. Physical work had always been his preferred method of thinking, and he had a great deal to think about. He worked through 2 hours of post setting and wire stringing before Earl appeared with the coffee, which was Earl's way of signaling that he wanted to know things without being the one to ask. Rhett took the coffee. Nothing happened. I didn't say anything, Earl said. You were about to. Earl crouched down beside the post hole and looked at the work with the critical eye of a man who has dug enough post holes to have opinions about other people's. Heard you walked her home. Word travels. Red Creek's not a big town. No, Red agreed. It's not. He drank the coffee. It was bad, the way Earl's coffee was always bad. Too strong, too long on the heat. But it was hot, and the morning was cold, and those 2 facts outweighed the flavor. I walked her home. We talked. I came back. Crow was watching you both all night. I'm aware. Denton, too. Rhett set down the coffee and picked up the wire stretcher. You think I don't know that? I think you know it, and you went ahead anyway, which is either brave or dumb, and I haven't decided which. Both, probably. Earl was quiet for a moment, which with Earl meant he was working up to the thing he actually wanted to say. Crow's been talking to Judge Harlan. Rhett looked up. About what? Don't know exactly. Harlan's clerk, a boy named Pete, drinks at the saloon on Thursdays, said there were papers involved. Land survey documents, something like that. Earl picked up a fence staple and turned it over in his fingers. Crow's been sniffing around the schoolhouse property for 2 years. Everyone knows it. He wants that parcel because it sits right between his east range and the creek access. The school's not for sale. The school's not for sale until somebody decides the school district owes enough back taxes that it has to be. Rhett straightened up slowly. Is that what he's doing? Pete wasn't sure of the details. But Harlan's not a man who takes meetings about nothing, and he sure as hell doesn't take them from men he can't profit from. Rhett thought about Evelyn at her gate. He wanted to humiliate me. She'd known it immediately, understood it for exactly what it was. And now it appeared the humiliation had never been the point. It had been the opening move of something larger. Why? Rhett said. Why what? Why does he want the school parcel bad enough to go after her personally? Earl dropped the staple. Because Crow doesn't separate things. If you own the land under a person's livelihood, you own the person. That's how he thinks. Always has. He stood up and dusted his knees. I'd watch yourself, Rhett. Standing up to that man at a dance is one thing. Getting in the way of something he's been planning for 2 years is something else. I know it. Do you? Rhett looked at him. I said I know it. Earl picked up the empty coffee cups and started back toward the bunkhouse, and he didn't say anything else, which was its own kind of answer. Rhett turned back to the fence line and worked for another hour without thinking about anything except the wire and the posts and the proper tension, and then he cleaned his tools and walked into town. I went to the schoolhouse. The morning session was still going when he arrived. He could hear her voice through the open window, clear and unhurried, asking a student something about long division. He didn't go to the door. He sat on the fence across the road and waited, which felt ridiculous but seemed better than interrupting. The children came out at noon, a noisy scatter of them, lunch pails swinging, and they passed him with the curious sideways attention that children give to unknown adults sitting on fences. He nodded at them in the general way of a man who is not specifically comfortable with children but means them no harm. Evelyn appeared in the doorway a few minutes after the last student cleared the yard. She saw him immediately, her eyes going straight to the fence, as if she'd somehow already known he was there. She crossed the yard and stopped at the gate. The hinge, he noted, was still crooked. "You're going to get a reputation," she said, sitting outside the schoolhouse. "I already have one, apparently. Town was talking about last night before breakfast." "Yes." She leaned against the gatepost. She was still in her teaching clothes, a practical gray dress, her hair pinned up more strictly than it had been the night before, back to the version of herself she wore for the classroom. "I had 3 mothers watching me through the window this morning during the first session. Usually it's one, and she's just nosy." "What were they looking at?" "Me, mostly, deciding whether I'm the kind of woman who attracts trouble or the kind who creates it." She said this without particular bitterness, just as a fact she'd filed. "There's a difference, in their minds." "Which did they decide?" "They haven't yet." She looked at him levelly. "What brings you here, Rhett?" He told her what Earl had told him. He told it straight, without softening it or dressing it up, because she'd already demonstrated she didn't want things softened. He watched her face while he talked, and saw the same thing he'd seen at the dance. The small tightening, the settling, the chin coming up. But this time there was something else underneath it. Something that looked for just a second like exhaustion. She pressed her lips together when he finished. "Judge Harlan," she said. "That's what I heard. Do you know him?" "Some. He's been on the bench for 12 years. He's not crooked exactly, but he's accommodating to men with money." Rhett paused. "Which is its own kind of crooked." "I've been to Harlan about the schoolhouse deed twice already," Evelyn said. "Last fall, when I first arrived, there were some questions about the property boundary. He told me the documents were in order and sent me on my way." She looked past him, toward the school building. "I wonder now what he wasn't telling me." "I can look into it." "How?" "I know the county land office clerk. She's been there 15 years and she keeps good records." He paused. "Better records than the ones people usually find in the official files, if you follow me." Evelyn looked at him. "You mean she keeps her own copies?" "I mean she keeps thorough copies, which sometimes differ in interesting ways from the official ones." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to get back to the children. Afternoon session starts in an hour." She pushed off the gatepost. "Come back tonight, 7 o'clock. I'll make coffee that's actually drinkable." "You don't trust me to handle this on my own?" "No," she said directly. "I don't trust anyone to handle things that affect my life on my own. That's not a comment on you specifically. It's just how I operate." He almost smiled. 7 o'clock, he said. He spent the afternoon at the county land office, where the clerk, a small, compact woman named Ruth Aldridge, received him with the wariness she applied to everyone who came in asking questions about specific properties. "The Ashcroft Schoolhouse parcel," Ruth said, pulling on her reading glasses. "You're the second person to pull that file in a month." "Who was the first?" She looked at him over the glasses with the expression of a woman who has been asked questions she can't answer for long enough to have refined her look of refusal to an art form. "You know I can't tell you that." "Was it a lawyer?" The look held steady and uninformative. "All right," Rhett said. "Let me ask a different question. Is there anything in that file that's changed in the past 6 months?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. She opened the file, turned to the second page, and ran her finger down a column of dates. Then she closed it. "The deed of record hasn't changed," she said carefully. "What's in this file is what's in this file." He caught it. "What's in this file?" "And what's not in this file?" She took her glasses off and polished them on her sleeve with the deliberate unhurry of someone who is choosing her next words with care. "The school district's property tax account," she said, "would be in a different file, under the school board administration records, which I also maintain." She looked at him. "But I can't share that information with a private party. Could you tell me if the account is current?" "I could tell you that in my professional opinion, anyone with an interest in the status of that account should request a formal review from the school board before next month's meeting." She put her glasses back on and looked at him with the blank, useful look of someone who has told him exactly what he needed to know without technically telling him anything. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" Rhett thanked her and left. He was back at the schoolhouse at 7, and Evelyn's coffee was, as advertised, considerably better than Earl's. She'd set up a small table in the front room, 2 chairs, a lamp, and the coffee, and she'd pulled several documents from somewhere and spread them across the table before he arrived. "I've been going through everything I received when I took the position," she said, before he'd fully sat down. "The original deed, the school board contract, the terms of the property lease." She pointed to a particular line in the lease document. "This clause. Read it." He leaned over and read it. Then he read it again. "The district retains occupancy rights contingent upon the maintenance of current tax status," he said slowly, "meaning if the property taxes fall into arrears, the district's right to occupy the building becomes challengeable." She sat back. "I didn't look at this clause carefully when I arrived. I should have. But there were 40 other things demanding attention, and the building seemed—" She stopped. "It seemed fine. It seemed settled." She pressed her fingers flat against the table. "I was an idiot. You trusted that the position you were hired for was stable. That's not idiocy. In a town with Silas Crow in it, assuming anything is stable without checking the paperwork is idiocy." She said it without self-pity, just with the flatness of a woman correcting her own error out loud. "Ruth Aldridge, you saw her today?" She can't share the tax account directly, but she was clear that anyone with an interest should request a formal review before next month's board meeting. Evelyn was quiet. "When's the board meeting?" 3 weeks. And if the account is in arrears and Crow has a purchase agreement ready, then it could move fast." Rhett wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "The school board has 5 members. Tom Garrett runs the mill. He's fair. Clara Whitfield, the doctor's wife. She's supported the school every session since it opened. 3 others, Hicks, Pomeroy, and Durant. They're businessmen. They'll go whichever way the wind blows if someone makes it financially worth their while." "Crow will approach Hicks, Pomeroy, and Durant," Evelyn said. "Not a question. He probably already has." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the documents. Then she said, "Do you know any of the ranching families who've had trouble with him?" Rhett looked up from his coffee. "Why?" "Because a land scheme like this doesn't appear from nowhere. If he's been acquiring property through manufactured tax problems or boundary disputes or other pressure, he's done it before. And if he's done it before, there are people who know it." She met his eyes. "Documentation doesn't just come from official files, Rhett. It also comes from people." He looked at her across the small table in the lamplight, and he felt the thing that had been building since the previous night take another step forward. Not desire exactly, though that was in there too, more like recognition. The particular recognition of finding a mind that works the way yours does, and the unsteadiness that comes with that because you'd stopped expecting it. "Frank Delacroix," he said. "He used to run a small spread about 12 miles north of here. Lost it 4 years ago. Supposed water rights dispute. He's been working day labor ever since." He paused. "Ada Reyes, her husband sold out under pressure 2 years back. She's told people privately what happened, but never formally. And old Walt Hester. He's still fighting a boundary claim that's been tied up in Harlan's court for 3 years." Evelyn was already writing. She'd produced a small notebook from somewhere, and she wrote quickly, the pen moving with the confidence of a woman who has taken notes in difficult rooms before. "Can you get me introductions?" "Some of them. Walt Hester's prickly. He doesn't trust anyone connected to the ranching establishment, which includes me. Let me talk to him." "He may not receive you either." "Maybe not," she said. "But I'm a school teacher and a woman, and I don't have any obvious stake in his land dispute. That gives me a better opening than you." She looked up. "People talk to me, Rhett. It's what I do. Children talk, and children tell me what their parents say at the supper table. That's how I knew about the tax clause before you got here tonight. Margaret Forsyth's youngest said something last week that I filed away and finally understood today." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "You've been watching this town since you arrived." "I've been listening," she corrected. "Watching implies you're expecting something to happen. Listening means you're taking in everything and sorting it as you go." She set the pen down. "I came to Red Creek thinking I was starting over. I understand now that I came here and walked directly into someone's existing scheme, which means starting over was never actually an option. What's an option is whether I let it run over me or whether I do something about it. And you've decided to do something about it." "I decided that about 12 hours ago," she said. "The moment you told me about Harlan." Rhett drank his coffee and thought about the 3 weeks until the board meeting, and about Frank Delacroix, and about Ruth Aldridge's careful language, and about a man sitting in a hotel room with 2 fingers of whiskey and the patience of someone who has never lost at anything he'd decided to win. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "The rumor that's been going around about your father, the bank collapse in Philadelphia." He said it straight, the way she would have said it. "It's been spreading faster in the past week. I've heard it in 2 places I wouldn't have expected it." He paused. "It has Crow's fingerprints on it, even if I can't prove that. He's salting the ground before the board meeting, making people doubt whether the school is well served by its current teacher, making them more open to a change." The stillness that came over Evelyn's face was the stillness of someone absorbing a blow they had been almost expecting but had hoped not to feel. Her hands stayed flat on the table. Her face stayed even. "That story was not secret," she said finally. "I knew it would follow me. It's one thing for it to follow you naturally. It's another for it to be deliberately circulated to specific people at a specific time." "Yes." She exhaled slowly. "Yes, there's a difference." She looked at the documents on the table. "My father was not a good man, Rhett. I want to be honest about that. He wasn't a villain either. He was a weak man who made choices that hurt people when he ran out of courage to do anything else. I spent 2 years being angry at him for that, and then I spent another year trying to understand it, and now I mostly just—" She stopped. "Now I mostly just try not to repeat it." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm trying to decide whether my father's particular failure was something I'm prone to myself." She said it with the directness that he was beginning to understand was not toughness, but something underneath toughness. The thing you get to after you've processed enough pain that you stop dressing it up. "Whether when things get hard enough, I'll find some way to step aside and let them happen to other people so I don't have to bear the weight myself." "Do you think you will?" She met his eyes. "Not if I can help it," she said. "But I thought my father wouldn't either, and he did." Rhett put his cup down. "You're not him. You don't know that. You've known me for less than a day. I know what I watched you do at the dance. Crow put 30 people's worth of silence and backing down in front of you, and you stood there anyway. Standing there isn't the same as winning." "No," he said, "but it's where winning starts." She looked at him for a long moment with that measuring quality she had, the careful, unsentimental attention she gave to everything. Then she looked down at her notebook. "We need to move faster than he's planning for," she said. 3 weeks before the board meeting isn't much time, but it's enough if we're systematic." She tapped the pen against the page. "You approach Delacroix and Ada Reyes. I'll find a way to Walt Hester. We need written statements, not just conversations. Something with dates and specifics that can be brought to the board formally." She looked up. "Can you get access to the original survey documents on the East Range boundary, the one that borders Crow's property? I know a surveyor. He did work out there 2 years ago." "Then get to him before Crow does." The lamp flickered between them, some draft from somewhere, the old schoolhouse full of gaps and imprecision. And in the unsteady light she looked for just a moment, less certain than her voice sounded. Not afraid exactly, just human. The lamp steadied and the expression smoothed out, and she was back to the level, clear attention she wore like a second face. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Not unkindly, genuinely. "I told you last night." "You told me you wanted a reason to walk over. That doesn't cover 3 weeks of land office visits and surveyor meetings." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he admitted. "It doesn't." "So?" He looked at her across the table and the documents and the 2 cups of coffee. "Because I've been in Red Creek for 6 years waiting to care about something enough to get involved in it," he said. "And this is the first time I have." She looked at him steadily. He couldn't tell if that was the answer she'd wanted or not. With Evelyn Ashcroft, he was beginning to understand. You rarely could. 7 o'clock tomorrow, she said, if you've spoken to Delacroix by then. I'll try. Don't try, she said. Go see him first thing in the morning. He went to see Frank Delacroix first thing in the morning. He found him behind the feed store, stacking 50-pound grain bags with the mechanical efficiency of a man whose body had learned to work without requiring his mind to be present for it. Delacroix was 52, lean and weathered past what 52 usually looked like, with hands that had been broken and reset badly enough that 2 of his fingers sat at slight wrong angles. "Rhett Calloway," he said when he saw him. He didn't stop stacking. "Hasn't been a time I was glad to see you or sorry to see you. You mostly just appear." "Frank, what do you want?" Rhett told him about the schoolhouse, about the tax clause and the board meeting and Crow's meetings with Harlan. He didn't editorialize, he just laid it out, which with Frank Delacroix was the only approach that worked. Frank stacked 3 more bags before he responded. "He's running the same play," he said. "Tell me." Frank set down the bag he was holding and turned to face Rhett with the expression of a man who has spent 4 years swallowing something bitter and has finally been offered a reason to spit it out. "4 years ago, I had 160 acres with water rights to the North Branch. Good land. Crow wanted it because it was the one piece between his east pasture and the river that he didn't control. He couldn't buy it because I wouldn't sell." Frank crossed his arms. 6 months later, I get a notice from the county that my water rights documentation was deficient, some filing error from 15 years back that nobody had ever flagged before. The correction process required legal review. The legal review required a judge. He paused. "Harlan found against me. On what basis?" "On the basis that the original survey was imprecise and the water rights claim couldn't be substantiated to the required standard." Frank said it the way a man says something that was false when it was said and has remained false for 4 years and will be false until he dies. 2 weeks after the ruling, Crow's man came with a purchase offer, half what the land was worth. "You took it." "I had a family, Rhett. I had winter coming." He uncrossed his arms. "So, yes, I took it." "Would you be willing to put any of this in writing? Dates, amounts, the name of Harlan's clerk, anyone else involved?" Frank looked at him for a long time. "What good does it do?" "It adds to a pattern. One man's story is a grievance. 4 men's stories with matching elements is evidence. Who's going to look at evidence? The school board might, if it's presented right. And if the board meeting goes badly, there are territorial authorities above Harlan." Rhett paused. "I'm not telling you it's certain. I'm telling you there's a woman in this town who's about to lose her school and her livelihood to the same scheme that took your land, and she's trying to stop it before it happens. And she needs people willing to stand behind what they know." Frank was quiet. The grain bags sat stacked behind him, orderly and heavy. "A school teacher," he said. "Yes." "Ashcroft, the pretty one from Philadelphia." "That's a way to describe her," Rhett said. "Not the most useful one." Something moved in Frank's face, not quite a smile, more the ghost of one. "No," he agreed. "Probably not." He looked at his broken-fingered hands for a moment. "All right, I'll write it down. You bring me paper and I'll write down everything I remember, which is all of it. I remember all of it." Rhett thanked him and left, and he stopped next at Ada Reyes's house on the south end of town, where he spent 40 minutes at her kitchen table while she told him what had happened to her husband's ranch in language that was quiet and precise and absolutely damning. By the time he reached the schoolhouse at 7 o'clock, he had 2 stories, 3 names he hadn't had before, and a surveyor's address in a town 20 miles east who had left Red Creek abruptly 2 years prior under circumstances nobody had explained. Evelyn was at the table already, the notebook open, the coffee made. She looked at his face when he came in and read it correctly. "You found something." "2 somethings," he said, "and a thread that might lead to a third." She pulled her chair closer to the table. "Tell me everything." He sat down and told her everything, and she wrote it all in the notebook in her quick, clear hand, and the lamp burned between them. And outside the Montana night was cold and indifferent and entirely unconcerned with what they were building at that small table in the old schoolhouse. Across town, Silas Crow received a visitor he'd been expecting, a man in a city suit who had ridden in on the afternoon stage and gone directly to the hotel. They spoke for an hour. The visitor left with a leather satchel he hadn't had when he arrived. Crow poured himself a drink after the man left and stood at the window and looked at the dark street the way he'd looked at it 2 nights ago. He was not concerned. He was, if anything, pleased. Things were moving along the lines he'd designed for them, and the only unexpected element, Rhett Calloway, 6 years a foreman, suddenly deciding he had opinions about things that didn't involve him, was manageable. Manageable, even, in ways that might prove useful. A man who had something to protect was a man with leverage points. Crow finished his drink and went to bed. He slept well, the way men sleep who have never learned to doubt themselves at 3 in the morning. Whatever Red Creek held for the next 3 weeks, he was ready for it. What he was not ready for was the 2 people on the other side of town who were, for the first time, building something he hadn't planned for. The surveyor's name was Cal Briggs, and he lived in a rented room above a harness shop in the town of Milford, 22 miles east of Red Creek, in a condition that suggested a man who had made a decision about his life 2 years ago and had been paying the price for it ever since. Rhett found him on a Thursday morning, 2 days after the conversation with Frank Delacroix. He'd ridden out before dawn, alone, not telling Earl where he was going because Earl would have asked questions that Rhett didn't yet have good answers for. The road to Milford was rough in the spring thaw, the kind of road that punished a horse for moving faster than a walk in the soft sections, and he arrived in town with mud on his boots and a horse that needed water and rest before the ride back. Cal Briggs opened his door in a way that told Rhett immediately the man had been expecting someone else, or rather, had been expecting someone to come eventually, and had spent 2 years deciding what he would say when they did. He was a small man, mid-40s, with precise hands and the slightly unfocused look of someone who had been drinking steadily enough for long enough that sobriety now felt like an altered state. "Calloway," he said. He didn't sound surprised. "You know me?" "I know of you. You work for Hargrove." He stepped back from the door. "Come in. There's coffee if you don't mind it cold." The room held a drafting table, surveying instruments that hadn't been used in some time based on the thin layer of dust across them, and a stack of papers that Cal Briggs crossed to and stood in front of the moment Rhett walked in, the way a man stands in front of something he's hiding without being fully aware he's doing it. "I came about the East Range survey," Rhett said. "The Crow boundary work. 2 years ago." Cal looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat down on the edge of the drafting table with the particular heaviness of a man whose legs have simply decided they're done holding him up. "I figured it would be someone from Crow eventually," he said, "coming to make sure I'd stayed quiet." "I'm not from Crow." "No, I can see that." He rubbed his face with one hand. "Then you're the other kind. The kind that wants to know what I actually found." "Yes." "And if I tell you, what happens to it?" "It goes to the school board. Maybe further, if we get the chance." Cal looked at his surveying instruments on the table, dusty and idle. "He didn't threaten me directly, you understand. Men like Crow don't do it that way. What happened was I submitted my survey findings, the accurate ones, the ones that showed his east pasture boundary was 200 yards inside where he'd been claiming it ran. And 3 days later, I received a letter from the county contractor board saying my license was under review for an unspecified compliance matter." He paused. "I'd had my license for 19 years without a single complaint. I'd never been reviewed. And suddenly, 3 days after I hand in a survey that's inconvenient for Silas Crow, I'm under review." "Did the review conclude?" "It was dropped 6 weeks later. No finding, no explanation. By that time, I'd already left Red Creek because it was clear to me what staying would mean." He looked at Rhett with eyes that were tired in a specific way. Not from lack of sleep, but from living inside a decision you can't undo. "I rewrote the survey. The version on file in the county office has the boundary running where Crow said it ran, not where I actually measured it." The room was very quiet. Rhett could hear the harness shop below them, the creak of leather, the occasional clank of a buckle. "You falsified the survey," Rhett said. "I altered it, yes." Cal said it flatly, without trying to soften the word. "I have a wife and 2 children in Milford. I had a license that was my family's income. I made a choice." He looked at the floor. "I've been making that choice every day since, which is its own kind of punishment. Would you be willing to put the true measurements in writing, the original findings, before the alteration? And do what with them? Add them to a pattern of evidence about how Crow operates. Evidence that would have to be presented somewhere. A board meeting, a court, somewhere official." Cal's voice was flat. "And when it comes out that I falsified a public record, my license is done, and I'm potentially looking at criminal liability." "I know that's a real risk," Rhett said. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Cal was quiet for what felt like a long time. Outside the window, Milford went about its business with no knowledge of the conversation happening above the harness shop. A woman called to someone across the street. A dog barked and stopped. "Write down what you need," Cal said finally. "The original measurements. I still have my field notes. I never destroyed them because I couldn't bring myself to, which is probably the only honest thing I've done in 2 years." He pulled open a drawer in the drafting table and extracted a worn field notebook with a cracked leather cover. "I'll write you a statement." You get it in front of someone who can actually use it before Crow has any reason to come looking at me again, and we might both get out of this. Rhett rode back to Red Creek with Cal's statement folded inside his coat, and he thought about the cost of things the whole way. The cost of staying quiet. The cost of speaking up. The different ways a person paid for each, and the way neither one was clean or simple or without damage to something that mattered. He told Evelyn about Cal Briggs that evening at the schoolhouse table, and he watched her face cycle through something complicated. The satisfaction of another piece falling into place, and underneath it, the weight of knowing what it had cost Cal to provide it. He altered a legal document, she said. He did. And you're asking him to expose that to protect a school he has no connection to. I asked him to tell the truth. What he does with that is his own decision. She was quiet for a moment, turning her pen over in her fingers. It's a real cost, she said. We should understand that. The people helping us are taking real risks. I know it. Do they understand that we may not win this? That we could collect all of this evidence and Crow could still have the board votes he needs? Delacroix understands it, Rhett said. Ada Reyes understands it. Cal Briggs understands it. And he came anyway. He looked at her. They're doing it because they've been sitting on it for years and they want it to mean something, even if the outcome isn't certain. She nodded, set the pen down. Walt Hester came to the school today. Rhett looked up. He came to you? He heard I was asking around. Someone told him, I don't know who, this town leaks information like a bad roof. She folded her hands on the table. He sat in the back of the schoolroom after the afternoon session with his hat in his hands and told me about his boundary claim. 3 years it's been in Harlan's court. The issue is a strip of land 40 feet wide along his north edge that Crow's attorney claims belongs to Crow, based on a deed from 1871 that Walt says is a forgery. Can he prove the forgery? He has letters from the original deed holder's son. The man is still alive, lives in Billings, saying his father never sold that strip of land, that the transaction in the 1871 deed never happened. She looked at the notebook. Rhett, if that's true, Crow doesn't just have a land scheme. He has a forged deed in a court proceeding. That's not a civil matter. Rhett sat back in his chair. The enormity of that moved through him slowly, the way large things do. Not all at once, but in pieces. You need that letter authenticated, and you need the son to be willing to testify. Walt said he'd write to him. He said the man has been wanting to come forward for 2 years, but didn't know anyone was paying attention. She paused. We need someone who can take all of this to a territorial level. Someone above Harlan who isn't in Crow's pocket. There's a territorial judge in Helena, Judge Amos Whitfield. He has no connection to Red Creek, and he's been on the bench since before Crow had any influence out here. Rhett thought about it. I don't know how to get to him directly. Clara Whitfield, Evelyn said. He looked at her. The doctor's wife. She mentioned to me once that she has a cousin in Helena who works in the territorial administration. She's on the school board, and she's been sympathetic from the beginning. Evelyn looked at him steadily. I think it's time we brought Clara into this more directly. It was at that moment that the front window of the schoolhouse rattled. Not from wind, it was a still night. The rattle had the specific quality of something deliberate, something that stopped just short of breaking, a sound designed to be noticed. Both of them went still. Then Rhett stood up, crossed to the door, and stepped outside into the dark. The yard was empty. The street beyond the fence was empty, or appeared to be. The gate was exactly as he'd left it when he came in, the crooked hinge catching the edge of the lamplight from inside. He stood on the step and listened and heard nothing except the ordinary sounds of a Red Creek night, distant cattle, the saloon 2 blocks over, wind in the pines at the edge of town. He came back inside. Someone was out there. Evelyn was standing in the middle of the room with her arms crossed, not hugging herself exactly, more like bracing. Denton, she said. Probably. Crow is watching the schoolhouse. It means he knows we're meeting, or suspects it. Rhett looked at the documents on the table. It also means he's getting nervous, which means he knows his timing is tighter than he'd like. Or it means he's warning us, Evelyn said, showing us that he can reach us here. Both things can be true. She looked at the window for a moment. Then she uncrossed her arms and sat back down at the table, deliberately, and picked up her pen. Then we work faster, she said. He watched her pull the notebook toward her and thought, not for the first time, that whatever she was, complicated and guarded and not always easy to read. She was not a woman who was going to fold. The next morning, Evelyn went to see Clara Whitfield, and she did it in the middle of the day, openly, walking the 4 blocks to the doctor's house with a book under her arm, so it looked like a social call if anyone was watching. Clara received her in the front parlor with a tray of tea she'd clearly been expecting to need for something, the way certain women anticipate crisis, the way others anticipate weather. Clara Whitfield was 58 years old and had been in Red Creek for 30 of them. She was not a woman who operated with the same kind of precision that Evelyn did. She was warm where Evelyn was careful, instinctive where Evelyn was systematic. But she had been in this town long enough to understand exactly who Silas Crow was, and to have quietly despised him for most of that time. "I've been wondering when you'd come to me properly," Clara said, pouring tea with the steadiness of a woman who has her hands in many things and has learned to keep them steady regardless. "You've been careful, which I respect, but careful only takes you so far." "I need to ask you about your cousin in Helena," Evelyn said. Clara looked at her over the teacup. "Marianne. If she has any access to territorial judicial administration, to the process for raising concerns about a district judge's conduct." Clara set down the teacup. "You're talking about Harlan." "I'm talking about a pattern of rulings over several years that appears to correlate very precisely with financial benefit to one specific party." Evelyn set the notebook on the table between them. "I have statements from 3 people whose land disputes were decided against them by Harlan, in circumstances that match a consistent pattern. I have survey evidence suggesting at least one of those rulings was based on falsified documents, and I have a 40-year-old deed in an ongoing case that may be a forgery." Clara looked at the notebook. She didn't open it. She just looked at it for a long moment with the expression of someone who has been carrying a suspicion for long enough that seeing it become real carries a particular weight. "Marianne works in the territorial governor's office," Clara said. "She's not judicial, but she knows people who are, and she's raised concerns before about how things work in some of the rural districts." She paused. "If I write to her, it takes at least a week to reach her and for a response to come back. Maybe 10 days. The board meeting is in 17 days. Then I should write today." Clara looked up from the notebook. "Evelyn, if this goes forward, if Marianne takes it to someone who acts on it, it will not be quiet. Harlan will know who raised the complaint. Crow will know. Everything you've collected will be examined, which means everyone who gave you a statement will be exposed. I know that. Frank Delacroix, Walt Hester. These are people with very little left to lose, but very little is not nothing." "I know that too," Evelyn said. "I've thought about it. I've thought about whether I have the right to ask people to take that risk for my school, for my situation." She held Clara's gaze. "And I keep coming back to the fact that it's not just my situation. Delacroix lost his land. Ada Reyes's family was broken up and scattered. Walt Hester has been fighting a court case he shouldn't have to fight for 3 years. This was happening before I arrived, and it will keep happening after me if nothing changes." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You're right," she said. "I just wanted to be sure you understood the weight of it." "I'm understanding it a little more every day." Clara reached for her writing paper. That same morning, across town, something else was happening. Hicks, one of the 3 swing votes on the school board, owned the largest dry goods operation in Red Creek and conducted his business affairs from a back office behind the main store. He was in that office when 2 men came in, not Crow directly, but men who worked for Crow, which amounted to the same thing. Denton was one of them. The other was a lawyer named Fitch, who had come in on the stage from the county seat. Hicks was a practical man. He'd been a practical man his entire life, which had served him well in dry goods and somewhat less well in terms of his ability to sleep soundly. He listened to what Fitch laid out: the tax arrears on the school district property, the purchase agreement Crow had prepared, the terms that would become available to parties who facilitated a smooth transition of the property. And he nodded in the places where nodding seemed expected, and he asked 2 questions about the terms, and he said he'd consider it. After they left, he sat in his back office for a long time looking at the wall. He had 3 children. The oldest 2 had been taught by Thomas Briggs, who'd been fine in the way that fine teachers are fine: adequate, reliable, unremarkable. The youngest was in Evelyn Ashcroft's classroom right now, and had come home 2 months ago and read aloud to the family at dinner from a book she'd chosen herself, which had never happened before in that household. He sat with that for a while. He did not make any phone calls. He did not send any messages. He put Fitch's card in his desk drawer and stared at the wall and thought about practical things. And he was still thinking about them when supper time came and he went home. Rhett heard about the meeting at Hicks's office from Earl, who heard it from a boy who'd been sweeping the floor of the dry goods store that morning and had ears the approximate size and utility of a mule's. He told Evelyn about it that evening. She received it without visible alarm, which he was starting to understand was not the same as not feeling it. Hicks is being approached, she said, which means Pomeroy and Durant are probably next, or have already been. She tapped the notebook. We need to know how the votes sit before the meeting, not the day of. I can talk to Tom Garrett. He's been solid from the beginning, and he'll know the temperature of the other board members better than anyone. Do that tomorrow. She closed the notebook. And there's something else I need to tell you. Her tone was different. Not alarmed. Evelyn's tones didn't really run toward alarm, but careful in a new way, the way you're careful when you're about to say something you haven't decided how to say yet. Margaret Forsyth came to see me this afternoon, she said. She came to apologize. Apologize for what? For telling Silas Crow what she knew about my father. Evelyn said it the way she said hard things, clean and direct, the same as always, but with a kind of stillness underneath. She didn't know he was going to use it the way he did. She said he was asking about me in a social way, or what seemed social, and she mentioned the Philadelphia situation without thinking about what it would mean. She paused. She was crying. She felt terrible. Are you angry? She thought about that. Actually thought about it rather than giving him the quick answer. A little, she said. It would be dishonest to say otherwise, but Margaret isn't the problem. She's a person who got used by someone who's very good at using people. She looked at her hands on the table. I told her that if she wanted to make it right, she could tell me exactly what Crow asked and exactly what she told him. And it turns out he'd been asking about me since before the dance. Specifically, he'd been inquiring about whether I had any financial vulnerabilities, any debts, any obligations. She looked up. He wasn't planning to humiliate me at the dance. The dance was an opportunity, and he took it, but it wasn't the plan. The plan was the schoolhouse property all along. I was just in the way. That makes it worse, not better. In some ways. In other ways, it makes it clearer. She folded her hands. He doesn't think of me as a person who can fight back. He thinks of me as an obstacle that needs to be removed. And the most efficient way to remove me is to make the school district want to be rid of me before the property deal goes through. So the rumors about your father are designed to make the board members think the school is poorly served by its teacher. If 2 or 3 parents pull their children over concerns about my character, the school board has an easier time justifying the closure and sale. She paused. It's efficient, actually. He's attacking the funding argument and the character argument simultaneously. He's underestimated you, Rhett said. He's underestimated both of us, she said. But let's not make the mistake of being pleased about that. Being underestimated only helps you if you use the time it buys. He was looking at her with the direct attention that, over the past 2 weeks, had stopped making her uncomfortable and had started feeling simply like the way Rhett looked at things, steadily, without flinching away when what he saw was complicated. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to know you can tell me it's none of my business. Ask. When you came to Red Creek, when you left Philadelphia, was there anyone? He paused, choosing the word with the same care he used for everything. Was there anyone you were leaving behind other than the situation? She was quiet for a moment. There was a man, she said. We were to be married. After my father's collapse, She stopped, adjusted. He was kind about it. He didn't make a scene. He simply made it clear over several months that the circumstances were no longer what he'd understood them to be when we'd gotten engaged, and that he needed to reconsider. He left you over your father's scandal. His family had a reputation to maintain. She said it without bitterness now, which was different from the way she might have said it a year ago. It was, in its way, honest. He could have stayed and made both of us miserable. He chose not to. She looked at Rhett. It's not that I don't understand why people leave when things get difficult. I understand it very well. I've thought about it a great deal. Is that why you're so careful about how much you trust people? One of the reasons? She met his eyes. Does that answer your question? It answers part of it. What's the other part? He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he was looking at the table rather than at her, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. I wanted to understand what I'm working with, he said. Not the situation, you. What you're carrying and what you've decided about it. She held that for a moment, the weight of it. The particular intimacy of being seen that carefully by someone who didn't flinch at what they found. I've decided, she said slowly, that I'm not going to let Philadelphia define this. I'm not going to let my father's failure be the thing that shapes every choice I make here. And I'm not going to let Silas Crow remove me from a life I've built, because if I let that happen, I'll spend the rest of my time wherever I go next waiting for it to happen again. She paused. That's what I'm working with. Then we're in the same place, Rhett said. He looked up. Because I've been letting what happened with my ranch define how much I was willing to put into anything. For 6 years. He said it plainly, without drama. I'm done with that. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, without saying anything, she turned back to the notebook and wrote something at the top of a new page. He leaned forward enough to read it. She'd written, what we know, what we can prove, what we need. Below the first heading she began to write, and he pulled his chair around to her side of the table so he could see the page clearly, and they worked through the evidence together until the lamp oil was running low and the street outside had gone fully quiet. The next 2 weeks moved with the particular double quality of time under pressure, simultaneously too slow and too fast. Days that felt like they lasted 40 hours while the board meeting date came toward them at a pace that seemed to accelerate the closer it got. Rhett talked to Tom Garrett, who confirmed that Pomeroy had been approached by Crow's lawyer and had come to Garrett afterward in a state of agitation, trying to understand what he was being asked to do. Durant hadn't spoken to anyone, which Garrett said could mean anything. Hicks, apparently, had been notably quiet in the days since Fitch's visit. Clara's letter reached Marianne in Helena, and a response came back in 9 days. Marianne had spoken to someone in the territorial judge's office. There was interest. There was a process for raising formal complaints about district judges that could begin with an affidavit filed by a private party. The process was not fast, but it was real, and it could begin before the board meeting even if it couldn't conclude before it. Evelyn drafted the affidavit herself, working from the statements Rhett had collected, and it took 3 evenings and 12 revisions and a disagreement that came close to being an actual argument about how to characterize Cal Briggs's role. Evelyn wanted to be precise about the falsification. Rhett wanted to give Cal a degree of protection in the language, and they settled on something that was accurate and as protective as accuracy allowed. On the 14th day, the rumor about Evelyn's father hit a new level. She found out about it from Tommy Garrett's daughter, who came to school with a note from her mother explaining that Tommy would be absent for the week due to illness, and who, while delivering the note, said, with the devastating honesty of 9-year-olds, "My daddy says some people think you might not be a good teacher because of your family." Evelyn received the note, thanked the girl, sent her to her seat. She taught the full morning session without anything in her face or voice betraying the note or what came with it. Rhett found out about it when he came at noon and saw the set of her jaw. "Tom Garrett's pulling his daughter," he said. "I don't know that for certain, but you think so?" She was very still for a moment. "It would mean we've lost one of our solid board votes," she said. "Because if Tom pulls his daughter, he becomes personally entangled in the question of whether the school should continue under my direction, and he can't vote to keep it open without it looking like he's ignoring his own family's concerns. Crow did this deliberately. He waited until the last week. Of course he did." She looked out the window at the empty schoolyard. "He's very good at this." "What do we do?" She turned from the window. "We go to the board meeting with everything we have and we let the evidence speak." She said it with conviction, but under the conviction he could hear for the first time the thin edge of something that wasn't certainty. It wasn't surrender either. He knew this woman well enough by now to know she didn't do surrender. But it was the sound of someone who has done everything right and is beginning to understand that doing everything right is not the same as winning. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She looked down at it, then up at him. "I have something to say," he said, "and I want you to hear it clearly, because I've been thinking about it for a week, and I'm not going to dress it up." She waited. "Marry me," he said. The room was very quiet. "Not to save the school," he said, before she could respond. "Not to change the politics of the board vote or make the rumors go away. Those things may follow, but they're not why." He held her eyes. "I've spent 2 weeks sitting at this table with you, And before that, 6 months watching you from across the room. And I know that's not a long time, and I know this is an absurd moment to say this, and I know you have 17 reasons to say no." He paused. "But I've spent 6 years not saying things because the timing wasn't right, or the situation wasn't right, or I hadn't thought it through enough. I'm done waiting for right." Evelyn looked at him for a very long time. The kind of time that doesn't feel long while it's happening, but that you remember afterward as having lasted much longer than it did. "You understand what you're asking," she said. Not a question. "I understand it better than I've understood most things. You're asking to take on everything that comes with me, the situation, the history, the board meeting in 3 days, and whatever comes after it. I'm asking to take on you," he said. "The rest of it is just weather." She was quiet. Her hand hadn't moved under his, and he hadn't moved his. "I told you about my father," she said. "About the man in Philadelphia." "You did. And you're not trying to be the thing that repairs that." "No," he said. "You don't need repairing. You need a partner." He paused. "I'd like to be that, if you'll let me." Outside the schoolhouse, the Montana spring was warming toward something better, the afternoons finally earning the right to push back against the cold, and the sound of the town going about its business came through the old walls with the particular muffled warmth of a world that didn't know it was holding its breath. She looked at their hands on the table. "Yes," she said. Not dramatically, not tearfully, just yes, the way she said everything, clear and direct and without decoration, which was the only way that would have meant anything coming from her. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. She pulled the notebook toward her with her free hand. 3 days, she said. "We still have work to do." "We do," he agreed. And they went back to work. They were married the next morning. Not at the church, not with a crowd, not with anything that resembled the kind of wedding either of them might have imagined at 20. They went to the county clerk's office at 8 in the morning, before the town had fully woken up, with Clara Whitfield as witness and Earl Pickett standing beside Rhett, looking like a man who has been informed of a fact so large he has temporarily lost access to his opinions about it. The clerk, a young man named Davis, who had been in the job for less than a year and had therefore not yet developed the practiced neutrality of the long-tenured civil servant, looked between them with unconcealed curiosity. "Both parties present and consenting?" he said. "Yes," said Evelyn. "Yes," said Rhett. Davis filled out the certificate with the careful penmanship of someone aware he is writing something official. Rhett signed it. Evelyn signed it. Clara and Earl signed as witnesses. The whole thing took 11 minutes. Outside on the street afterward, with the practical warmth of a woman who expresses emotion through the quality of her grip rather than its duration. Earl shook Rhett's hand and then appeared to consider saying something and then decided against it. "Coffee?" Clara said, meaning her house, meaning right now. "We have work," Evelyn said. Clara looked between them and appeared to process this without surprise. "Of course you do," she said. She squeezed Evelyn's hand once. "The board meeting is the day after tomorrow. Let me know what you need from me." They walked to the schoolhouse together, Rhett and Evelyn, in the early morning with the town just beginning to stir around them. Neither of them said anything for most of the walk. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence was comfortable, which was a thing Rhett had noticed about being with her. She didn't fill silences just to fill them, and she didn't expect him to either. At the gate, still crooked, hinge still loose, something he now thought of as a standing item on an imaginary list, he stopped. "I should fix that," he said. She looked at the gate. "Today?" "After the meeting." "After the meeting," she agreed. They went inside and spread the documents across the table for the last time before the board meeting, and they went through them in order. Delacroix's statement, Ada Reyes's account, Walt Hester's situation with the Billings letter now in hand confirming the 1871 deed had never been executed, Cal Briggs's field notes and written account of the altered survey, and the affidavit they'd sent to Helena. "We have the pattern," Evelyn said. "We have it clearly. The question is whether the board will look at it. The question is whether the board is already decided before they walk in." She moved Delacroix's statement to the top of the stack. "Clara says Hicks hasn't committed. Duran is almost certainly in Crow's column. Pomeroy she's less sure about. Tom Garrett." "Tom Garrett is the one I keep coming back to," Evelyn said. She set the pen down. He's a fair man. He's been fair from the beginning. If he pulls back because of the rumors about my father, it won't be because he believes them. It'll be because he's worried about being on the wrong side of the community opinion. Then we need to change what the community opinion is before the meeting. She looked at him. How? He'd been thinking about this since the previous afternoon, since the 9-year-old had delivered the note about Tommy's absence. The people who've given us statements, Delacroix, Ada, Walt, they live in this town or near it. Their neighbors know them. If they talk, not formally, not deposition style, just talk to the people they know. The story that's been going around about you gets complicated. It's one thing to believe rumors about a school teacher nobody knows. It's harder when Frank Delacroix, who everybody knows lost his land under bad circumstances, is saying publicly that the same man who took his land is now coming for the school. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. You're asking them to be public about it before the meeting, not just witnesses on paper, visible. Yes. That's a larger ask. It is, he said, and it's their choice. But I think some of them want to make it. I think Frank Delacroix has been waiting to say what happened to him in a context where it might do some good. She considered it. I'll talk to Ada. You talk to Frank and Walt. She pulled the notebook toward her. And we need to think about the meeting itself, the order in which we present things, who speaks first. You should speak first, Rhett said. You think so? I know so. The board is already primed to see you as a problem. If you walk in there and you're precise and organized and you know the documents better than anyone in that room, which you do, it changes the frame. He paused. You're not the school teacher defending herself. You're the person who's done the most work and has the most information. She looked at him with the measuring attention she gave to things she was deciding whether to trust. You're not wrong, she said. I just want to be sure I'm going in there because I'm the right person to lead it, not because I need to prove something. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Rhett said. She almost smiled. It was the almost smile she had, the one where the corner of her mouth moved and her eyes changed, but the full thing never quite arrived. He'd come to watch for it. No, she said, they're not. The day before the board meeting, Frank Delacroix had lunch at the saloon, which he did every Thursday, and he talked. Not loudly, not with performance, just in the way a man talks when he has something to say and has finally decided to say it. By 3 o'clock, what Frank had said at lunch had reached the livery, the mercantile, and the back room of the feed store where a group of ranchers gathered most afternoons to talk about weather and prices and the general inconvenience of existence. Walt Hester, who rarely came into town at all, came into town. He stood in front of the land office for 20 minutes talking to 2 men that Rhett recognized as ranchers from the North Range, men who had their own concerns about the way property claims had been handled in the county in recent years. The conversation had the quality of something that had been waiting to happen for a long time and had simply needed a gathering point. Ada Reyes had coffee with 4 women on her street. She told them what she'd told Evelyn, minus the legal specifics, plus the human ones, what the loss of her husband's ranch had meant for their family, where they'd ended up, what the years since had looked like. Women who had known her for years and hadn't known this heard it and carried it home with them. Rhett watched these things happen from a careful distance, not orchestrating exactly. The people doing it had decided to do it themselves, but there and available if anyone had questions or needed encouragement or was losing their nerve. By evening, Red Creek felt different. Not transformed. It wasn't that simple, but different in the way a room feels different when someone opens a window. The same furniture, the same walls, but something moving through it that hadn't been there before. At the hotel, Silas Crow received a visit from Denton, who stood in the doorway and told him what was happening around town with the expressionless delivery of a man reporting weather conditions. Crow listened without visible reaction. Calloway organized this? Looks like it was the teacher and Calloway together. She's been talking to Delacroix and the others for 2 weeks at least. I know that, Crow said. He'd known about the evening meetings at the schoolhouse. He'd assumed, with the confidence of someone who has operated the same way for 20 years without significant consequence, that what they were building was too small to matter against what he'd already put in place. The board votes are what they are. Hicks may wobble, but Durant and Pomeroy are settled. Tom Garrett is the question, Denton said. Garrett will recuse himself if the tension around his daughter gets high enough. A man with a conflict of interest stepping back from a vote isn't bad for us. Denton was quiet for a moment. There's something else. The teacher sent an affidavit to Helena, to someone in the territorial office. A very brief pause. If you weren't watching Crow's face carefully, you would have missed it. How do you know this? The mail writer talks when he drinks. Crow picked up his glass, looked at it, put it back down without drinking. Do we know what it contained? Not specifically, but the Helena contact. Denton paused. It's Judge Whitfield's office that was mentioned. This time the pause was longer. Crow stood up and walked to the window, which was his habit when he was recalibrating. He stood there for a moment with his hands behind his back. Who else knows about the affidavit? Just the mail writer, far as I can tell. And what's in it? Like I said, we don't know exactly. Find out. Crow turned from the window. His voice was the same even tone it always was, but something in the room had changed in the same way a barometric pressure changes before a storm. You couldn't point to a specific thing, but you felt it. And find out before tomorrow morning. Denton left. Crow stood at the window for another few minutes, and then he sat back down and poured his drink and drank it, and he thought about Rhett Calloway, and about a school teacher who had, apparently, been doing considerably more than teaching school. He had underestimated the pace of it, not the direction. He'd known from the first night that Calloway was going to be a complication. But the pace. The 2 weeks of systematic collection, the Helena connection, the way they'd worked through the community without announcing themselves. He wasn't worried. He was something more precise than worried. He was recalculating. The board meeting was at 10 o'clock in the morning in the town hall, which was a generous term for the building. A single large room with a low ceiling, plank floors, and enough folding chairs to seat perhaps 60 people. The chairs were usually half empty at board meetings, which were generally attended only by the directly interested parties and a handful of citizens with nothing more pressing to do. By 9:45, every chair was taken. Rhett arrived with Evelyn at 9:30, and even then people were already filling the room. Ranchers he recognized from the North Range, families from town, faces he didn't know from the outlying areas who had apparently heard enough to make the trip in. Frank Delacroix was there, sitting in the third row with his hat on his knee. Ada Reyes sat beside him, her coat still dusty from the road. Walt Hester stood at the back of the room against the wall with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has finally decided to be somewhere, even though being somewhere costs him something. Clara Whitfield was already seated in her board chair, which was one of 5 arranged at the table at the front. She caught Evelyn's eye when they came in and gave one steady nod. Tom Garrett arrived at 9:50, saw the room, and stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in before he found his seat at the board table. His face was unreadable, but his eyes moved across the crowd with the quality of a man doing a rapid and serious reassessment. Hicks came in at 9:55 and sat in his board chair with the careful posture of someone who knows that everyone in the room is watching him, because everyone in the room was watching him. Durant arrived with Pomeroy at 9:58, and both of them saw the crowd and exchanged a look that Rhett read clearly. They had not expected this. Silas Crow came in at 10 o'clock exactly. He was alone. No Denton, no Fitch. He took a seat near the back, in the corner, at a slight remove from the main body of the audience, which Rhett recognized as strategy, positioning himself as a disinterested observer rather than a party to proceedings. He met Rhett's eyes across the room and held them for 2 seconds, then looked away. The board chair, Durant, called the meeting to order with the mechanical efficiency of a man who wants to get through an agenda as quickly as possible. He read the items. The school district property tax status was third on the list, behind 2 minor administrative matters that he moved through in under 10 minutes. When he got to the third item, Evelyn stood up. Durant looked at her. The floor is for board members at this stage of, I have documentation relevant to the tax status item, Evelyn said. Her voice carried clearly in the crowded room. Not loud, just clear, the voice of a woman who knows how to make herself heard in a room full of people. I'm requesting 5 minutes to present it before any vote is discussed. Durant looked at Hicks. Hicks looked at his hands. Tom Garrett said, let her present. Durant appeared to calculate the room. The calculation took him about 3 seconds. 5 minutes, he said. Evelyn walked to the front of the room and laid the documents on the board table, and she didn't apologize for being there, and she didn't ease into it. She started with the tax account. The specific figure, the specific date, the arrears appeared on the account, and the specific anomaly she'd identified with Ruth Aldridge's help. The arrears had been calculated using an outdated assessment rate that hadn't been applied to any other district property in the county. It was a technical point, dry as dust, but the room was quiet enough that the dryness didn't matter. Then she moved to Crow's purchase agreement, which she laid on the table with a specificity that made Durant sit up slightly in his chair. She had the document number, the date it had been prepared, and the name of the attorney who had filed it, which was 3 days before the tax arrears notice had been sent to the school district. The purchase agreement was prepared before the arrears notice was issued, she said, which raises a question about the sequence of events that I think this board should consider before voting on whether to authorize the sale. The room was very still. She then laid down the surveyor's statement from Cal Briggs. She explained what it contained: the altered boundary survey, the original measurements, the timing relative to the water rights case, without editorializing, just describing. Then Delacroix's statement. Then Ada Reyes. Then Walt Hester stood up from the back wall and said, without waiting to be recognized, "I'll speak to mine myself, if the board will hear me." Durant looked at Tom Garrett. Tom Garrett looked at Durant. "The board will hear you," Tom said. Walt Hester walked to the front of the room, and he spoke for 4 minutes without notes, in the direct way of a man who has rehearsed something so many times in his own mind that the words have worn grooves. He talked about the boundary dispute. He talked about the 1871 deed. He held up the letter from the Billings man and read 2 sentences from it into the room. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than what had preceded it. It was the silence of a room in which something has shifted, and everyone present knows it, and no one has yet decided what to say. Silas Crow stood up. "I'd like to address the board," he said. He was smooth. Rhett would give him that. He came to the front of the room with the ease of a man who has spoken in rooms like this many times and lost in none of them. He said that the documents being presented were speculative, that the allegations against the survey were the claims of a man who had left the county under his own professional difficulties, that the tax issue was a matter of public record with nothing irregular about it, and that the purchase agreement he had prepared was standard practice for any businessman interested in a parcel that might come available through normal administrative process. He was good. The words were right, the tone was measured, but the room was different than it would have been 2 weeks ago. The room had Frank Delacroix in the 3rd row, and Ada Reyes beside him, and Walt Hester still standing at the front, and a crowd of people who had spent the previous 2 days absorbing a different account of things. The words were right, but they were landing in soil that had already been turned. When Crow finished, Tom Garrett said, "Does the board have questions for either party?" Hicks looked up from his hands. "I have a question," he said. The room turned to him because Hicks had been notably quiet for the past 2 weeks, and the room understood this was the moment. "Ms. Ashcroft." He paused, then corrected himself, having presumably just registered the morning's news through the town's efficient communication system. "Mrs. Calloway, the date on the purchase agreement. You're saying it was prepared before the arrears notice?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "By 3 days." Hicks was quiet for a moment. He looked at the document. "And the arrears calculation, the outdated assessment rate, that applies only to this property?" "Only to this property, in the current county records." Hicks looked down again. He picked up the purchase agreement, looked at the date, set it down. He said nothing else, but what he'd done was enough. He'd put the questions on the record, in public, in a room full of witnesses. Durant cleared his throat. "The board will take a brief recess to consider." "There's one more thing," Rhett said. The room turned to him. He walked to the front and laid down the last document, Clara's letter from Marianne and Helena, the one confirming that the territorial judge's office had received the affidavit and opened an inquiry into district court proceedings in Red Creek County. "This doesn't resolve today's vote," Rhett said, "but it means that whatever this board decides today will be reviewed by people who have no stake in the outcome except getting it right." He looked at the board table. "I wanted the board to have that information." The recess lasted 22 minutes. Rhett sat with Evelyn in the front row, and neither of them spoke. Clara's face at the board table gave nothing away. Delacroix was still in the 3rd row. The crowd held. Crow sat in his corner and looked at nothing in particular. When the board reconvened, Durant called the vote with the air of a man who has revised his expectations and is not entirely comfortable with the revision. The motion to approve the tax sale and transfer of the school district property to the Crow Cattle Company. All in favor. Durant raised his hand. Pomeroy, after a pause, raised his. 2 hands. Clara's hand stayed down. Hicks's hand stayed down. Tom Garrett's hand stayed down. Durant counted. Motion fails 3-2. He said it flatly. The tax account will be referred for independent audit. He moved to the next item on the agenda as if the room had not just done what it had done. The response from the room was not a cheer. It was something quieter and more durable than a cheer. A collective exhale. A shift. A sound like people who have been holding something for a long time finally setting it down. Evelyn sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes forward, and Rhett watched her and let her have the moment on whatever terms she needed. Crow stood up before the meeting was formally adjourned and walked out. No drama. No scene. He walked out the way a man walks out of a room when a meeting has concluded, efficiently, without looking at anyone. Denton materialized from somewhere near the door and fell in beside him. 3-2, Denton said quietly, once they were outside. I can count, Crow said. He didn't break stride. This doesn't end here. The Helena inquiry? I know what the Helena inquiry means. He walked, and his voice stayed even. It means the next move has to be cleaner. What's the next move? Crow didn't answer immediately. They walked the half block to the hotel, and he pushed through the door and went up the stairs without stopping. In his room, he stood at the window again, in the position that was his thinking position, and he looked at the street below where a small group of people was spilling out of the town hall with the particular collective lightness of people who have expected one outcome and received another. He watched Calloway come out with his wife. The word arrived in his mind with a texture he hadn't anticipated. The married woman, the different legal status, the recalculation that entailed. He watched Delacroix shake Calloway's hand. He watched the school teacher, the wife now, stand in the street with her head not quite up, but her shoulders level, receiving people coming up to her one by one with the contained stillness of someone who is managing a large feeling carefully. She turned at one point and looked directly at the hotel window. She couldn't see him. The light was wrong for that. But she looked at it the way she looked at things, steadily, without flinching away. Crow moved back from the glass. The immediate problem was Helena. If the territorial inquiry gained traction, the boundary issues, the Hester deed, the Briggs survey, all of it would get examination. His lawyers could manage some of it. Some of it was genuinely ambiguous, which ambiguity he'd been relying on for years. But Cal Briggs's field notes in the hands of someone with authority to act on them, that was a problem of a different order. He needed to move on Briggs. Not threaten. He'd learned, finally, that overt threats produced witnesses. He needed to discredit. A man who'd altered official documents had a credibility problem. And if that credibility problem was raised loudly enough in the right places, the field notes became the contested claims of a man with a documented history of falsifying records rather than evidence of anything. He sat down at the writing desk and pulled out a sheet of paper and began to compose a letter to his attorney. He was still a patient man, still a man who had never lost anything he'd truly decided to win. 3-2 was a setback, not a defeat. And the difference between those two things was the question of what came next. Back in the town hall, the crowd was thinning. Walt Hester found Evelyn before he left and stood in front of her with his hat in his hands again, the same posture he'd had in the schoolroom 2 weeks ago. Don't know if it'll help my boundary case, he said. The inquiry. It should, Evelyn said. If the inquiry examines the deed, your case gets looked at. Takes time. Yes, it takes time. She met his eyes. I know that's not nothing. He nodded. He put on his hat. Your school stays open, he said, as if it needed saying, as if saying it was a thing he needed to do. My school stays open, she agreed. He left, and Frank Delacroix left, and Ada Reyes left with a brief, firm pressure of her hand on Evelyn's arm that said everything she hadn't put into words, and Clara hugged her again with the same practical grip. Hicks passed Evelyn on his way out and stopped for a moment. He was not a man who apologized easily. She could see that in the set of his jaw, but he made an attempt at something near it. Whatever the situation was, or wasn't, he said, My youngest is getting a better education than she's had before. He moved his hat between his hands once. That counts for something, to me at least. Thank you, Evelyn said. He left. Rhett was beside her by then, and they stood in the emptying town hall with the folding chairs disarranging themselves around them, and the morning light coming through the high windows and slanted columns. And she turned to him, and for the first time since the dance, in the bright ordinary light of a public room with nobody particularly watching, she let her face do what it was going to do. It wasn't dramatic. Her eyes were dry. She simply looked like herself without the careful management she normally applied to herself. And that absence of management was, for her, the equivalent of what other people expressed with considerably more noise. We didn't finish it, she said. No, Rhett agreed, not by a long way. He's not done. He's not done. She nodded, acknowledging this without being defeated by it. What did you see when you looked at him, when the vote came in? Rhett thought about Crow at the window of his hotel room, which he'd been watching from the street below. I saw a man revising, he said. He wasn't angry, he was thinking. That's more dangerous than angry. Yes, Rhett said, it is. She straightened her shoulders in the subtle way she had, the particular squaring that you noticed only because it was always preceded by a moment when she let them drop. Then we keep working. We keep working. Tom Garrett found them on their way out of the building, and he stopped them with a hand briefly on Rhett's arm. He had the look of a man who has made a decision he's at peace with but wants to be accountable for. My daughter will be back in school on Monday, he said. She was never actually sick. That was... He paused. That was me being cowardly. I should have come to you directly. You voted right, Rhett said. I should have done more, sooner. He looked at Evelyn. She talks about your class at dinner 3 nights a week. My wife's been telling me for months that you're the best teacher we've had. He seemed to feel the inadequacy of saying this now, on the other side of the vote, when it would have mattered more, said earlier. I should have trusted that. Evelyn looked at him with the unsentimental directness she gave to everything. Bring her back Monday, she said. That's enough. He nodded and went. Outside, in the May sun that was finally starting to justify calling itself warm, the street of Red Creek went about its business. The saloon, the mercantile, the livery, the land office with Ruth Aldridge inside keeping her thorough records. The hotel, where Silas Crow was writing a letter. The schoolhouse at the end of the block with its slightly crooked gate. Rhett looked at the gate. I said after the meeting, he said. Evelyn followed his eye line. The corner of her mouth moved. You did. 15 minutes. I'll need some scraps from the hardware. A new pin. He looked at her. Come with me. She looked at the gate, at the day, at him. All right, she said. Yes. They walked toward the hardware store in the May morning, and the town moved around them, and what had been built in the past 3 weeks, in the evening lamplight of a small room at a table covered in documents, moved with them, imperfect and incomplete and not nearly finished, but real in the way that things are real when 2 people have made them together out of something that cost them both. The gate was going to take longer than 15 minutes. It always did, with old hinges and warped wood and the particular stubbornness of things that have been wrong for a long time. But Rhett had time, finally, and something worth fixing, and that was enough to start with. The gate took 40 minutes, not 15. The old hinge pin had rusted into the wood so thoroughly that Rhett had to work it loose with a flathead and a mallet borrowed from the hardware store, and the wood itself had warped enough that fitting the new pin required planing the frame down on one side, which required a plane, which required another trip back to the hardware store. Evelyn watched the first 10 minutes of this, and then went inside and came back with coffee, and she sat on the porch step while he worked, and they talked about nothing in particular. The weather, the state of the north pasture fence, whether the school needed new arithmetic primers before fall, in the way that people talk when what they're really doing is something else entirely, something quieter and harder to name. When he finally got the gate swinging clean and level, he stood back and looked at it with the critical attention of a man who knows the difference between a thing done and a thing done right. Better, Evelyn said. Should have done it 3 months ago. You didn't have a reason 3 months ago. She stood up from the porch step and came to stand beside him, and they both looked at the gate, which was an ordinary gate in front of an ordinary schoolhouse, and they were both aware that the looking was not really about the gate. What happens next, she said. Not about the gate. Helena moves when Helena moves. He'd said this before, various versions of it, over the past several days. It was true each time, and it was also insufficient each time, which was the nature of the kind of waiting they were in. The inquiry is open. That means Crow's options narrow. He can't make another run at the property without everything being examined in a context he doesn't control. But he hasn't left. No. Crow had not left Red Creek. 4 days after the board meeting, he was still in the hotel, still receiving visitors, still present in the particular way of a man who considers leaving to be a form of concession. He's working something. The Briggs discrediting, Evelyn said. Rhett nodded. This was what he'd been watching, the thing that had been assembling itself in the weeks since the board meeting through channels that were hard to pin down but easy to feel. Someone had raised questions in Milford about Cal Briggs's professional history. Someone had contacted the county contractor board about the same compliance matter that had been dropped 2 years ago, asking why it had been dropped. The someone in both cases had no name attached to it, which was itself a kind of signature. If they can undermine Cal's credibility, the survey evidence goes soft, Rhett said. And without the survey, the pattern we built is thinner. We have Delacroix. We have Walt's deed issue. Those are real, but Cal's notes are the only piece we have that directly shows document falsification. Everything else is pattern and testimony. Pattern and testimony can be argued around. Falsified survey records are harder to argue around if the original field notes hold up. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then we need to get Cal ahead of this. He needs to file formally with the territorial office before Crow's people discredit him. A man who files voluntarily, who comes forward on his own terms with his original field notes and a clear account of what he altered and why, is harder to dismiss than a man who has the story dragged out of him. Cal knows that, Rhett said. I told him when I took his statement. The question is whether knowing it is enough to make him do it, given what it costs him. She looked at him. Will you go to Milford again? He already knew the answer. He'd known it since the discrediting campaign started making itself felt. Tomorrow morning, he said. He rode to Milford alone again, early, in a morning that was finally warm enough to make the ride something other than endurance. Summer was arriving in the way Montana summers arrive, not with the slow persuasion of spring, but with a kind of decision, the temperature crossing some threshold and staying there as if it had simply made up its mind. Cal Briggs opened the door in better shape than the first visit. He'd been sober, or closer to it, and the dusty surveying instruments on the table had been moved, not put away exactly, but repositioned in a way that suggested they'd been handled recently. I've been expecting you, Cal said. Same words as the first time, different meaning. He stood back from the door. You've heard, Rhett said. Someone from the contractor board came to see me 3 days ago, asking about the compliance review, asking why I left Red Creek. He poured coffee, better than last time, actually, hot, and set a cup in front of Rhett without being asked. I told him I had nothing to add to what was on record. That bought you some time, not much. I know that. Cal sat down across from him with both hands around his cup. I've been thinking about what you said last visit, about filing voluntarily. And I've been trying to weigh it. He looked at the coffee. If I file, my license is almost certainly finished. The falsification is on record, whatever the circumstances around it. I could face charges, depending on who looks at it and how. Those are real consequences. Yes, he paused. But if I don't file and Crow's people get to the contractor board first and shape the story, I lose the license anyway, probably, and whatever credibility the field notes have gets destroyed along with mine, and nobody benefits from what I know except the people who wanted it buried. He looked up. Either way, I lose the license. The question is whether I lose it for something or for nothing. Rhett didn't say anything. This was Cal's math to do, and doing it for him would have been a disservice. Cal set down the cup. I need to talk to my wife. Of course. Come back in 2 hours. Rhett went and found the town's single diner and had breakfast and waited. And at the 2-hour mark, he walked back up to the room above the harness shop, and Cal opened the door with a different quality of stillness. The stillness of someone who has made a decision and is now living in the 30 seconds before they have to act on it. She said, do it, Cal said. She said she'd rather be married to a man who told the truth late than one who kept lying to protect a license. He paused. She's a better person than I am. She knows you better than you know yourself, maybe, Rhett said. That's not the same thing. Cal looked at him for a moment. Then he went to the drafting table and pulled out the cracked leather field notebook and set it on the table alongside several sheets of paper, and he sat down and began to write. Rhett sat in the corner and didn't rush him. Cal wrote for an hour and 20 minutes, careful and precise, the way surveyors write when they're putting something into permanent record. Dates, measurements, names, the sequence of events, the specific language of the letter he'd received from the contractor board, the specific changes he'd made to the survey document, and where the original measurements could be verified against the field notes. When he finished, he signed it, and Rhett signed it as witness, and they made 2 copies. "One goes to the territorial office directly," Rhett said. "I'll take it." "And the other?" "You keep it. Somewhere he can't reach." Cal looked at the copies on the table. "Tell me honestly," he said. "Does this do anything? Or is it a good man's gesture that gets swallowed by someone with more money than I'll ever see?" Rhett thought about the board meeting, about Walt Hester standing at the front of the room reading 2 sentences from the Billings letter into a room full of people who'd been waiting to hear something like it for years, about Hicks picking up the purchase agreement and looking at the date. "I think it does something," he said. "I can't promise you it does enough. But I've seen enough in the past 3 weeks to know that evidence in the right hands, at the right time, can move things that looked immovable." Cal was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "Then let it move something." Rhett rode back to Red Creek with the statement inside his coat and arrived in the late afternoon to find Evelyn at the kitchen table of the small house they'd been sharing since the wedding. The attached schoolhouse residence, which was not large and was not particularly comfortable, and which they had not yet had time to discuss changing, with 3 letters spread in front of her and an expression that told him before he read them that something had happened. "From Helena," she said when he came in. She didn't say anything else. She let him read. The first letter was from Mary Ann, Clara's cousin. The territorial inquiry into district court proceedings had been formally opened. 2 judges from the territorial bench had been appointed to review the record of cases in Red Creek County over the past 7 years. They would arrive in 4 weeks to conduct interviews. The second letter was from the county land office. The independent audit of the school district tax account, ordered by the board at the meeting, had identified the assessment error. The arrears figure had been recalculated. The school district owed significantly less than the original notice had stated, and the corrected amount fell within the range that the district's existing operating fund could cover without requiring emergency action. The third letter was from a man named Aldous Crane, who identified himself as a territorial land attorney in Helena and explained that Walt Hester's boundary case had been referred to his office for review on the basis of concerns raised about the 1871 deed. He had been in contact with the man in Billings. The review was proceeding. Rhett read all 3, in order, and then set them on the table and looked at them for a moment without saying anything. "The inquiry," he said finally, "in 4 weeks. They'll talk to Harlan. They'll talk to everyone." She folded her hands on the table. "Including the people who gave us statements, which means 4 more weeks of Crow knowing exactly what's coming and having time to prepare for it. He can't undo 3 years of rulings. He can't unwrite Cal's field notes. He can try to discredit the people presenting them." She paused. "We knew this was the shape of it. This isn't a surprise." "No," Rhett agreed. "It's not." He put Cal's statement on the table beside the letters. "This helps." She read it. She read it carefully, the way she read everything, and when she finished, she looked at the field notebook, which Cal had sent along with the statement. "He sent the original notes," she said. "He thought they were safer here than in Milford." She held the notebook for a moment, aware of what it had cost the man to send it. "We should make copies, tonight." "Yes." They worked that evening, making copies of the field notes in Evelyn's hand, which was cleaner than Rhett's, and then Rhett took the originals to Ruth Aldridge the following morning and asked if the county land office would hold them in safekeeping as supporting documentation for the territorial inquiry. Ruth looked at the notebook and looked at Rhett and said, "I'll put them in the secure file," with the particular expressionlessness of a woman who has been waiting 15 years for someone to hand her exactly this. What followed was not clean or fast or without cost, because nothing real is. The 4 weeks before the territorial judges arrived were the longest Rhett could remember since the winter he'd spent settling his former partner's debts, which had also been a long and unglamorous stretch of doing the right thing for reasons that were clear in principle and exhausting in practice. Crow's campaign to discredit Cal Briggs continued through the contractor board and through a letter his attorney sent to 2 territorial newspapers suggesting that the surveyors who had submitted documentation to the inquiry had histories of professional misconduct. The letter named Cal without naming the inquiry directly, which was the kind of precision that expensive lawyers were good at. Evelyn drafted a response and sent it to the same newspapers under her own name, with her title, Teacher, Red Creek, Montana, and laid out the timeline of Cal's field notes against the timeline of the contractor board review with the same clean, factual precision she'd used at the board meeting. One of the newspapers ran her letter. The other didn't. It was imperfect, the way everything was imperfect. It was also something. Frank Delacroix was approached twice by men he didn't know, asking questions about his land dispute and his financial situation in ways that were not quite threatening but were clearly designed to communicate that he was visible and that his visibility was noted. He came to Rhett after the second approach and told him about it with the flat effect of a man who has been living on the underside of things long enough that intimidation reads to him as routine. "They want me to know they see me," Frank said. "I know," Rhett said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Frank said. "I'm telling you so you know it's happening. I'm not changing my statement." He paused. "I already lost everything once by staying quiet. That was enough of that." Walt Hester's situation moved more slowly than the others, because the 1871 deed question required careful legal examination, and the man from Billings, who was 76 and had the caution of a man who had watched too many promises not materialize, required 3 letters and a visit from Territorial Attorney Aldous Crane before he agreed to provide a sworn affidavit. But he agreed. And once he agreed, the question of the deed stopped being a matter of conflicting claims and became a matter of documentary evidence, which was a different and more powerful thing. Evelyn taught school through all of it. This was the thing that people who didn't know her might have found strange. The way she continued to stand in front of a classroom of children every morning and teach arithmetic and reading and geography while the machinery of the inquiry ground forward around her. But it made sense to Rhett, who understood by now that the teaching was not separate from the fighting. It was the same thing. It was the specific thing she'd come here to do, the thing she'd built from the ground up in a town that had initially met her with more curiosity than welcome, and doing it well every day was its own form of statement about who she was and what she was worth. The children didn't know about the inquiry. They knew their teacher had gotten married, which was the subject of about 2 weeks of whispered speculation that she handled with the matter-of-fact directness she handled everything. Tommy Garrett came back on Monday, as Tom had promised, and brought Evelyn an apple with the solemnity of a child who has been instructed to make an apology but has decided to make it on his own terms. Hicks's youngest, a girl named Bess, turned in the best arithmetic test of the term in the 3rd week of June and brought it home to show her father, who put it on the kitchen shelf and left it there. The territorial judges arrived on a Thursday in late June, 2 of them, both from Helena, neither of them connected to any Red Creek interest. They set up in the town hall and they talked to people for 5 days. They talked to Harlan, who came to the interviews with his own attorney and the composure of a man who has survived scrutiny before. They talked to Delacroix and Ada Reyes and Walt Hester and Cal Briggs, who rode in from Milford with his wife, and sat in front of 2 territorial judges and told the truth about what he had done and why and what the original measurements had been, with the field notes on the table in front of him. They talked to Rhett. They talked to Evelyn. They talked to Ruth Aldridge for 2.5 hours, which was the longest single interview of the 5 days, and Ruth emerged from it with the same expressionless efficiency she brought to everything and returned to the land office without comment. They talked to Silas Crow. That conversation lasted 90 minutes and was conducted behind a closed door, and nobody who was not in the room knew exactly what was said in it. The judges left on a Monday morning and returned to Helena. The waiting that followed was the kind that wears on people differently. Earl, who had not been directly involved but had watched the whole of it from the bunkhouse, processed the wait by talking more than usual, which was saying something. Clara Whitfield processed it by baking, which was her established response to uncertainty. Frank Delacroix processed it by going back to stacking grain bags with the same mechanical efficiency as before, except that something in the set of his shoulders was different, looser, or less braced, as if he'd put something down even before knowing how it would land. Rhett processed it by working. The north fence, the south pasture, the bunkhouse roof that had needed attention since winter. Physical work that required his hands and left his mind operating at a lower register, where things were simpler and the outcome was visible. Evelyn processed it by not processing it, or by processing it in private in the way she did most things. In the mornings before he woke, or late at night when she thought he was asleep. He knew because he wasn't always asleep, and he had learned to recognize the specific quality of her silence when she was thinking something she hadn't decided yet whether to say. One night, 3 weeks into the wait, he said into the dark, "You can say it." A pause. "Say what?" "Whatever you've been working on for the last hour." Another pause. "I've been thinking about my father," she said, "about whether he ever sat up at night like this, waiting for something to go one way or the other, worrying about it. I think he probably did. And then when it came time to make the choice, the real choice, not the theoretical one, he chose wrong anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "That's what I think about. That you can be afraid of the right things and still make the wrong decision when it counts." "You didn't," Rhett said. "Not yet." "Not this time," he said. "And that's the only time you have." She was quiet again, but the quality of it changed, less weight in it, or more settled, which for her amounted to the same thing. "You're a practical man," she said. It was not a complaint. "I try to be." "It's useful," she said. "Annoying sometimes, but useful." He almost smiled in the dark. "I'll take that." She turned toward him, and he felt the shift of it. "Whatever happens," she said. "Not finished yet." "Whatever happens," he said, completing it, because he understood what she was saying even without the end of it, and she knew he understood, and that was enough. The results of the territorial inquiry arrived in 2 stages, the way large things usually do, not all at once, but in pieces that accumulated into something conclusive. The first stage came 6 weeks after the judges left, in the form of a letter to the county addressed to Judge Harlan, a copy of which reached Evelyn through Clara's cousin, who understood by then that the 2 women on the other end of that information chain were the people who needed it most directly. The letter informed Harlan that the territorial bench had found sufficient cause to recommend a formal review of his conduct in 7 specific cases over a 5-year period, including the Delacroix water rights case, the boundary cases involving Crow's East Range, and Walt Hester's ongoing dispute. Harlan was placed on administrative suspension pending the review. The second stage came 4 days later, when 2 federal marshals rode into Red Creek and spent the afternoon at Crow's hotel, and when they left, Silas Crow left with them. He was not arrested. That was important to understand. The legal machinery was not that fast, and what moved with the marshals was not handcuffs, but a summons to appear before a federal commissioner in the territorial capital regarding charges that included conspiracy to defraud, submission of falsified documents in a court proceeding, and interference with a public official. The charges were the beginning of a process, not the end of one. They could be fought, and Crow had money to fight them, and the outcome was genuinely uncertain. But he left Red Creek. He walked out of the hotel in the company of 2 federal marshals in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, with Denton behind him carrying his luggage, and the street doing what small-town streets do when something significant happens on them. The particular stilled attention of people who are watching history that will be retold over supper for years. Rhett watched from in front of the hardware store. He watched Crow walk to the waiting vehicle, and he watched Denton load the luggage, and he watched the whole thing with the flat attention of a man who feels something but is still sorting out what it is. Evelyn was at the school. She found out when Bess Hicks came in from recess with the information delivered in the breathless, half-formed way of children transmitting news they don't fully understand. "Mr. Crow is leaving with some men. My mama is watching from the porch." Evelyn had finished the afternoon session before she went outside to find Rhett. She found him at the gate. He'd fixed the gate 6 weeks ago, but he was standing at it now, one hand on the post, looking down the street in the direction the vehicle had gone. She came up beside him and stood there with him. "He'll fight it," she said. "For years, probably. He may win some of it." "He may," Rhett agreed. "But Frank gets his day, Walt gets his day, Cal gets to be the man who told the truth, which is all he was asking for." He paused. "The school stays open." She looked at the gate, level now, swinging clean on the new hinge. "Frank told me something last week," she said. "He said that what he regretted most about staying quiet for 4 years wasn't losing the land. It It was what staying quiet did to how he felt about himself. She paused. He said he felt like he'd gotten his land taken twice, once by Crow and once by his own silence. Rhett thought about that. He's right. Yes. She turned and looked at the schoolhouse behind her. The building itself, old and imperfect, the roof that leaked in one corner when the rain came from the north, the windows that stuck in the summer heat, the front steps that needed new boards on the left side. The ordinary building where she stood in front of children every morning and tried to give them something they could use. I've been thinking about what this was, she said. All of it. What to call it. What do you call it? I keep coming back to documentation, she said. Which sounds boring, but it's not. It's the idea that the truth needs witnesses. That a thing that happened but left no record is just a story someone tells at a table and no one can prove. And that when you take the time to write it down, to be specific, to put names and dates and measurements on it, you're not just protecting yourself. You're making it real in a way that outlasts the moment. She paused. My father never wrote anything down. He kept everything in his head, which meant when things collapsed, there was nothing to hold anyone accountable to anything, including him. She looked at her hands. I've thought about that a lot. You came here and you started writing things down, Rhett said. I came here and I started teaching children to write things down, which is the same instinct. She almost smiled. I never quite connected those two things before. He looked at her. The woman who had walked off a stage in a frontier town 8 months ago and set her shoulders and decided how much of herself she was going to offer to strangers, which, as it turned out, was less than he'd initially seen and considerably more than he'd understood at the time. The woman who had told him her worst story through a picket gate in a cold spring night without asking for anything in return. Who had sat across a small table from him night after night and worked alongside him with the unsentimental focus of someone who had decided that the only honest way to live was to do the actual work of whatever you said you believed in. She was not who he'd imagined 6 months ago when he watched her from across a dance hall and thought he knew what she was. She was considerably more inconvenient and considerably more interesting, and she was not always easy, and neither was he. And what they had built together in the past several months was the kind of thing that had been built right, which meant it had been built imperfectly and had cost something, and would probably require maintenance for as long as it lasted, which he intended to be a long time. There's something I want to tell you, he said. She looked at him. When Earl told me at the dance that you were someone I'd been watching and thinking about for 6 months, he wasn't telling me anything I didn't know. He paused. What I didn't know, and what I couldn't have known from watching from across a room, was that you were going to be the hardest thing I'd ever done and the most worthwhile thing I'd ever done, and that those two things were going to be exactly the same thing. He looked at the gatepost under his hand. I wanted you to know that, not because anything needs resolving, just because it's true, and you should have it. She looked at him for a long moment with the measuring quality she had, and then without that quality, which was rarer and which he recognized as the moment she'd decided to trust what she saw. I know, she said. I've known for a while. You could have said, so could you? He almost smiled. Fair. She reached over and put her hand on his, on the gatepost, not holding it exactly, just placing it there. The contact was brief and unambiguous. Walt Hester's boundary case will be settled within the year, she said. Aldous Crane sent word this week. The Billings affidavit combined with the inquiry findings puts the forged deed essentially beyond defense. Frank? Frank is talking to a land agent about a parcel north of town. Small, 60 acres. He says it's enough to start with. She paused. I don't know if he'll get there, but he's talking about it. That's different from where he was 6 months ago. Very. She took her hand back. Ada's family came back. Her son and daughter-in-law. They'd moved to Billings, but with the financial pressure from the Crow situation resolving, they can afford the area again. She came in last week to tell me. She cried. She said it the way she said things that moved her, accurately, without dressing it up. I almost cried, which almost never happens. I've seen you almost cry twice, Rhett said. Both times you caught it before it got there. I have a classroom. I can't cry in front of 40 children. You're not in front of 40 children right now. She looked at him. No, she said. I'm not. And something in her face settled into something quieter and more open than her usual mode, which was not the same as crying but was adjacent to it in the way that most honest things are adjacent to each other. He put his arm around her, not dramatically, not ceremonially, just the way you put your arm around someone you've stood beside through something difficult and intend to stand beside through whatever comes next. She let it happen, which was its own kind of statement from a woman who did not typically let things happen to her without deciding to first. They stood there at the gate for a while, in the late afternoon of a Montana summer, the kind of evening that makes you understand why people came west in the first place. The quality of the light, the scale of the sky, the mountains sitting at the edge of the world, with the patient indifference of things that have outlasted everything and will outlast everything still to come. What Rhett understood, standing there, was something he hadn't had language for at the dance and still didn't have perfectly clean language for, but that he'd been working toward the whole of his adult life without knowing that's what he was doing, that the things worth having are exactly the ones you can't acquire by force or money or patience or cleverness alone, that they require you to be present for them, and honest inside them, and willing to keep showing up even when the outcome is uncertain, which is to say, always, because the outcome is always uncertain. The board meeting had been 3-2. 3-2 was not a landslide, it was barely a margin, but it was enough. And it had been enough because a foreman with a pinched toe had walked across a dance floor, and a schoolteacher from Philadelphia had told him the truth through a picket gate in a cold spring night. And two people who had each spent years keeping their distance from anything that asked too much of them had decided, more or less simultaneously, to stop doing that. What came after was not a story about winning. Crow's legal proceedings stretched into the following year, the way such things do, and some of what he'd built survived the scrutiny and some of it didn't. Harlan's review concluded with a formal censure that ended his judgeship, but short of the criminal charges some had hoped for. Cal Briggs lost his license, as expected, and received a suspended sentence, and he moved his family to a town further east and started over in land sales, where his knowledge of survey work served him in ways that didn't require a license. His wife was right about him being a man worth staying married to, which he spent the rest of his life trying to deserve. Frank Delacroix got his 60 acres. He didn't get back what he'd lost, because that wasn't available, but 60 acres with water access was enough to build something new, and he was a man who knew how to build and was no longer spending his energy on silence. Walt Hester's boundary case was the following spring, the forged deed set aside. The strip of land returned to his claim. He was 63 years old, and his best years of ranching were behind him, and he knew it, and he went back to his land anyway, and did what he could with what he had, which was how he'd always lived. Evelyn taught in Red Creek for 11 more years. The schoolhouse got a new roof in the second year, funded by a public subscription that Clara Whitfield organized with the particular cheerful iron she brought to everything. The roof stopped leaking from the north. The front steps got new boards. The gate stayed level on its hinge. She taught children who grew up and remembered specific things she'd said in specific moments, the way you remember the teachers who treated you like the person you were still becoming. Tommy Garrett became a surveyor, which was either irony or continuity, depending on how you looked at it. Bess Hicks, the arithmetic girl, went to university in Missoula, the first person from her family to do so, and she sent Evelyn a letter when she arrived that said, among other things, that she had not been afraid of the mathematics. Rhett built the ranch. Not overnight, not without setbacks. A bad winter in the third year that took a significant portion of the herd, a drought the year after that. The ordinary cascade of difficulty that frontier ranching visited on everyone without particular preference. He built it anyway, the way you build things when you've decided that what you're building matters more than whether it's going well at any given moment. By the time his oldest child was old enough to ride fence with him, the ranch was something he was genuinely proud of, which was a feeling he'd had very little practice with, and which he received, when it arrived, with some surprise. They had 3 children. None of them were easy. None of them were supposed to be. There's a thing about people who come to each other sideways, through difficulty and complication, and the particular vulnerability of having already lost something. They don't take the easy parts for granted because they know how to count. They know that the ordinary evening, the coffee made just right, the gate that swings clean on its hinge, the child asleep in the next room, the weight of someone you trust beside you in the dark. They know these are not small things. They know because they remember what it was like before them. Rhett Calloway knew it every time he walked through the level gate. He'd fixed it in 40 minutes one May afternoon, with borrowed tools and warped wood and more effort than it should have taken, and it had worked ever since. That was not a metaphor for anything. It was just a gate, and it worked, and that was enough. Evelyn knew it every morning when she stood in front of a room full of children who were becoming something, though none of them knew yet what. She knew it the way you know things that you've had to earn. Not with comfort exactly, but with a solidity that comfort can't produce on its own. A spring dance in a frontier grange hall. A man crossing a floor. 12 words that were simultaneously a lie, and the most honest thing he'd ever said. She's mine. He'd said it to stop something. He'd said it without a plan and without knowing the woman it was meant to protect, and without any reasonable expectation that it would become the first sentence of the next chapter of his life. That's how most important things begin. Not with clarity or intention or a fully considered plan, but with a moment of decision so fast it outpaces the doubt that would have stopped it. You go, or you don't go. You cross the floor, or you stay at the wall. You open your mouth, or you stay quiet. And those choices compound across time until you look back and understand that you were building something. Even in the moments when it felt like nothing more than putting one foot in front of the other on a cold spring night with your good boots on and your right foot already hurting. The floor gets crossed. The gate gets fixed. The truth gets written down. It takes longer than it should. It costs more than you planned, and you don't always win. But some things you do, and the people you do them with become the people you can't imagine having done without. And the life you build together is imperfect in all the ways that lives are imperfect, and irreplaceable in all the ways that lives are irreplaceable. That was Red Creek, Montana. That was Rhett Calloway and Evelyn Ashcroft, and the spring that changed everything. That was enough.